Thank you so much, Sir Hilary, for that wonderful, wonderful walkthrough of your essay and your ideas. And I'm going to try as much as possible to stick with that. I'm not going to have too many questions for you because I do want to prioritize the questions from the audience. Everyone start thinking, but I'm going to try to look at the stages that you've set out. And I wanted to start actually with history, because that's how you start. And I'm a historian myself, so that's where I'm comfortable. But I wanted to ask you about something that I felt was slightly missing in your essay, and I think it has also been slightly missing as well in this conversation so far, which is Africa's little secret. I remember a few years ago when Dr. Henry Louis Gates tried to speak about the fact that African leaders, and particularly some of the nations that you've mentioned, Yoruba, Akan, were complicit in the slave trade. You allude to it slightly in the essay, the complicity of Africans to the slave trade. But surely, Sir Hilary, can we be surprised? African leaders were in the 19th century some of the strongest defenders of slavery. So really nothing has changed. Why did we expect that it would have?
Well, first of all, I do not believe that Africans were complicit in the slave trade. I want to make that perfectly clear. I don't believe it. I probably doesn't give enough attention to it. And I do intend to write a book about that at some point in the future. So I'm not a believer in that. And this is why. You cannot have a major crime. You cannot have a major international crime without local participants. It is impossible. But the presence of some local participants does not mean that the nation is complicit. Let me give you an example of this. If you consider, for example, from what you read in the media, if you consider what you read in the media, that a lot of drugs and narcotics entering the United States might very well pass through the seaports and the airports of Miami. The only way those narcotics are going to get through the airports and the seaports of Miami into America is if there is local participation. But nobody goes the step further and say, the American people are drug trafficking people. The American people are participants. Nobody goes there. Nobody goes there and say, the American nation or the people of America are drug traffickers. Nobody goes there. But they recognize that there are a few participants somewhere in the system that allow it to function. And you try to identify who they are and why, but you don't make the general statement. And I don't know why the Western European scholars why Africans have bought into this notion from Western scholars. Oh, the slave trade was a partnership. It was a partnership between the Africans and ourselves. That is nonsense. And each time I hear an African scholar buying into that, let me tell you, when those African communities were up against the might of those European multinational and highly organized militarized slave trading corporations, when the British Royal African Company, organized by the royal family, organized into a military armada with regiments of soldiers, and they arrived on the African coast, the West Africans had never seen anything like that. They had never seen before massive fleets of ships arriving, highly armed with cannons and all of that military power. And they say, we want you to hand over some of your people. Now, you can enter the conversation about what actually happened. And you need to study, we do need to study what actually happened. You know, there was a tremendous ground war. There was a war on the ground. There was a war on the ground by the ordinary everyday African citizen. A war on the ground by those people against the slave traders. They did whatever they could. There was warfare, there was resistance, they did all they could. Yes, from time to time, one of their leaders joined up with the slave traders. We have no doubt. But when the leaders join up with the slave traders, we don't say that the people were complicit. The people might have been betrayed by their leaders from time to time, but we also know that the Africans and their leaders also fought and resisted bravely over a long period of time. We know all of that. So we cannot fall the victims of the propaganda. In fact, the very presence of complicit individuals, whether they were kings or other prominent persons, their very presence of these people actually made the crime even more heinous, even more hideous, and made the resistance of the ordinary people on the ground even more heroic. And that is what we have to get into. So it is not a little secret. It's a subject that should be properly discussed and analyzed. It's not a dirty little secret. It is something that should be very clear. And I know that many African leaders actually have come to believe this. I have gone out to West Africa to meet specifically with African chiefs from Benin, right through Nigeria, Ghana, the chiefs who have a history going back to that period. And they will speak about what happened in their family, that, you know, that this king would fight for 20 years and then the next king would capitulate and fall into line. And then you have another king who would organize armies to fight against slave trade. And then there was another king who gave in and ran away. So you had the tremendous volatility of political responses to the slave trade. And that history needs to be studied very carefully. But it is fundamentally not true to say that either African families, African chiefs, African countries, African nations were complicit. That is very, very dangerous propaganda.
Thank you so much, Sir Hilary. I think that that's one of the things that's come up in the chat so far. And I like the pushback that you've put against that, and also setting it in context as well. I'm just going to ask you one or two more questions, and then we'll hand over to the floor. The next question I wanted to ask was about the idea that Pan-Africanism was broken by Durban. So it seems that for as long as Pan-Africanism has existed, or the word has existed, it's always been a concept that's suffered from one form of semantic crisis or another. But what you seem to suggest is that Durban placed not a semantic crisis, but also an existential crisis as well. My question is, was this existential crisis created by the events at Durban, or was it simply exposed at Durban?
That's a pretty good question, indeed. It's probably best to begin with expectations. When African Americans, African Caribbean, and African Europeans, when they all arrive in Durban from London, New York, Kingston, Jamaica, Bridgetown, this whole group that represented the so-called diaspora, I think when it arrived at Durban, it really collectively expected that the African heads of state there would have stood in solidarity with them on the question of having reparatory justice stay on the agenda and so on. I think that was an expectation. I think they were, first of all, surprised and not disappointed, but they were surprised that the US had taken such a strident view on the matter, that Colin Powell, Condoleezza Rice had, as African Americans, have set up this opposition to this question. I think they were surprised by that, not disappointed, because it was a Republican government, and I think they had an understanding of what was going on there. I personally, who was at the center of much of the diplomatic dialogue, I couldn't understand why the two dialogues could not have taken place simultaneously. Meaning, this is a global summit. The African diaspora has come from the Caribbean as states. Coming from Europe and America, they were coming as individuals, organizations. So they were not in the main plenary hall, they were in the civil society hall. But those of us who were in the plenary hall representing nations, I remember, for example, we were seated alphabetically. Beckles, so I was sandwiched between A and C. So I was sandwiched between Arafat and Castro. So I was there between these two giants, and we were going to speak alphabetically. But I remember Fidel Castro, who whispered to me, he said, "I wish that I can live long enough to see reparatory justice become a norm. I wish I could live to see it." He said, "It will become," he said, "don't give up." He said, "They will fight against you, but don't give up. Don't give up." You know, and that was important to me, certainly. Arafat, I couldn't quite, there was a language communication, but I remember when I spoke and I came back and I spoke, I remember a few minutes later, he shook my hand and he whispered something to the effect that this is the most important conversation. This is the most important conversation in the 21st century. You know, this issue of repairing colonial damage. So there was this sense. So when Obasanjo and Wad came over and they spoke and they said, "Well, we can't support this. We can't support this," because they were all dealing with World Bank issues. They were all dealing with financing for their own development plans and their own strategies. And there was a belief, there was a genuine belief that if African countries that were in the clutches of the World Bank for financing for development issues and so on, IMF programs, that they would have paid a price if they had supported the reparatory justice conversation, that their own national projects at the World Bank board or the IMF board, that they would have suffered a pushback and they were not prepared to pay that price. So I think that was very much clear, certainly to us, because the notion that we should compromise for a few benefits, no, that was not on the table. That was not their thinking. I believe that their fundamental thinking was the fear of the multilateral pushback on their request for financial support for development. And that was where the West had gone. And remember, in those days, the IMF was very punitive. The IMF we have today isn't the IMF of 20 years ago. The IMF of today is much more prepared to be flexible, to understand issues of development and indigenous concepts. It's a much more flexible institution now. But back then it was demonic, you know, in terms of undermining Black conception of their development paradigms. There was also a view out of Nigeria. I didn't think about this deeply, and maybe some of my Nigerian colleagues can help. There was an argument that there was concern about the coherence and the sustainability of the republic, that within Nigeria itself, there were so many ethnic differences. Of course, we all remember the Nigerian Civil War, but there was still this view of the Civil War in the back of people's minds. And different ethnic groups had played different roles in the slave trade. Some groups had been more victimized than others. Some thought that they could compromise and make deals. So the whole Calabar culture of negotiating a deal down the river and through the ports, and then the victimization of the people up the hinterland who were really the hardcore victims of that slave trade. The notion that you will open up wounds of history, because the people in Nigeria have a very clear oral memory. They have a very clear cultural memory of what actually happened. And it's somewhere in the back of their mind. They speak about it and so on, but the depth of the impact of the slave trade upon their culture and civilization is still with them. and they did not wish to litigate it. They did not wish to litigate it, that it would open up wounds, and before you know it, you might end up with national problems of social coherence. That argument was made. I don't know how strong that argument is, and Obasanjo was probably more concerned, some people have said, about the coherence of the republic than about the IMF program. But time will reveal all of these issues, no doubt.
Yeah, and thank you so much for that response. And I think, you know, even me as a Nigerian, there's obviously the issue of domestic slavery that continues to today, and those conversations as well that I think people are sometimes reluctant to have. I wish I could. Oh, sorry, you wanted to say something?
Yes, I was going to say, so the end point of your question as to whether we were trying to fix a broken structure, or whether it was broken, it became broken on arrival. Durban was unique. It was a testing ground, and it was unique. It wasn't even the United Nations, because, you know, at that time, Caribbean governments would go to the United Nations and they would have different opinions on international foreign policy issues. So it was perfectly normal that a Caribbean country and African state would vote differently on the floor of the UN on the issues before the General Assembly. So that was understood, but that was not seen as a big problem, so to speak, right? If Nigeria and Barbados took different views on climate change, if Jamaica and Ghana took different views on the Palestinian question, so they took different views on all of these matters before. But I think when they got to Durban and the issue was reparations for slavery, that became a new dynamic. That solidarity should happen. This is not a political issue of international interest. This is an issue of morality. And therefore, there should be no diversity. There should be an agreement. And I think it was the depth of the passion around post-apartheid South Africa. We were in post-apartheid South Africa. Nelson Mandela was alive. And everyone was trying to get the opportunity while they were there to go and see former President Mandela. So yes, so we all wanted to go and see and pay respect to Mandela. But right there under his nose, there was this debate as to why we could not find coherence on something like reparations from slavery. So I think while there were always going to be fractures, when an organism has fractures, you learn to live with fractures. But when you have a systemic rupture, then that is a different issue altogether. And I think what Durban did was to take all the multiple little fractures and consolidated them into a systemic breakdown. And I think Durban was a breakdown.